Ex-Convicts, what's the worst thing you've ever seen a guard do while in prison? I had a friend whose brother was a prison guard. He had some stories, but the one I remember was a time where there was a prisoner in solitary for a while who had become very attached to a praying mantis that had somehow made its way into his cell. The mantis lived with him for quite some time, and he loved it like it was his friend. One day, a prison guard who wasn't aware of the mantis being important to this prisoner stepped into the cell, saw the mantis, and promptly slammed his hand down on it to kill it. The prisoner was understandably devastated. Wow, didn't expect this to get much attention. To clarify some things, this happened at least 10 years ago in Australia. It was not the US prison system. I don't know much about how the Australian prison system runs, but my understanding is that it's not quite as inhumane as the US system. The fact that they used solitary confinement sucks, but it wasn't as bad as it was in the US. Okay, am I the only one that feels like really bad for the praying mantis in this situation? That sucks. Inmate finally made a friend and he got smashed. Story 2. I worked at a max facility and I was super respectful. No need to not be, ever. And the men there were always super respectful back. It's frustrating that other officers didn't realize this, and administration didn't realize that the same officers who kept having issues were having issues because they were starting it. I really enjoyed my job. I was super strict because I have a fear of getting in trouble. I communicated well and seriously never had any issues. My favorite memory was I was working straight 16 to 17 hour shifts for 27 days in a row before I was scheduled for a major surgery. The inmates knew because it was a small prison and no one keeps their mouth shut. But I was sitting in the guard box on the yard and I looked at my watch and it was 1700 and blinked and it was 1800 and an inmate's tapping on the window, letting me know second shift was on so I wouldn't get in trouble. I obviously didn't mean to fall asleep. I was just exhausted. It was just a super nice thing to do. Story 3. Ex-convict here. There's a long list of effed up crap that I've seen, and it's hard to really say which was the worst. SA and assault is obviously the worst out of the gate, but there's a lot of close seconds because of how long the effed up things would last. Forced semi-starvation is one. Being in lockdown in our cells for weeks or months at a time without being allowed into the commons meant we basically lived as if in solitary confinement. Usually got put on lockdown because someone effed it up for everyone, but sometimes it was an unwarranted lockdown. It came with a whole host of issues, but lack of food was common. Meals were passed through the doors on trays during lockdown, accidentally forgetting 3/4 of the meal portions on specific trays, or forgetting certain cells' trays completely would mean that an inmate would get just enough food to survive, but would be slowly starved. It was usually just a specific CO who had a grudge against a specific inmate, versus a collaborative effort, but knowing that you're going to not get at least 2 of your meals for the day and having no alternative way to get out of your cell to procure food for weeks at a time was awful. There was also something called tile therapy. It was when a CO would decide that you needed an attitude adjustment and would do a takedown, tackle, to restrain you and take you to solitary or your cell, instead of simply cuffing or even verbally escorting you. If an inmate fully warranted it, it was not referred to as tile therapy. Tile therapy specifically referred to the hyper-aggressive, completely unnecessary, and violent nature of the takedown in proportion to the offense that determined the need for a takedown. It usually involves smashing the inmate's face into the tile during the initial tackle to stun and subdue them, but would also include a variety of battery and such. For example, a CO once broke an inmate's jaw from slamming his head into the tile floor so hard during one such takedown. I don't even remember what the dude supposedly did because it was something so minor, like not having his uniform shirt tucked in. And there was just so much coercion and manipulation and crap in general. COs had the power to make your life a living hell if they so desired, and they had a plethora of creative ways to punish you on the books and off. I served 8 years, so I have a lot of stories. Story 4. One unit I was on had a thing about making you run and work out beyond what your body could handle. Run laps until you puke, do sit-ups for an hour, then a half hour of burpees, then run till you puke again. If you became weak or fell from exhaustion, you have to add in something else like 15 minutes of mountain climbers. If the whole unit was on punishment, we would have to run single file and circle back a lap to pick up the stragglers. We wouldn't stop until we completed 5 miles without having a straggler. There were times we were out there for hours on end just running. You'd feel like your body went through a meat grinder by the time you were done. Being forced to do the CO's grunt work was a favorite punishment they doled out. Blood all over a room after some tile therapy. CO doesn't want to clean it up. Make an inmate scrub it up as punishment, etc. Never was given proper PPE or materials for cleaning. I was forced to clean so many bloody rooms without proper supplies that I was legitimately concerned about my risk for contracting bloodborne pathogens. One of the first things I did when I got out was go get tested for HIV, Hep C, and anything else they could test me for. Dehumanizing punishments were just about as bad because of the toll it takes on you mentally. One person took too long in the shower, and when asked why, they said they felt extra dirty/stinky and was just trying to scrub up extra. Shared showers was legit. CO decided punishment for the infraction of going over shower time would be a publicly announced shower program to correct a hygiene issue and having to take a 10-minute shower every hour for a week. So basically outed them as being crusty with such bad hygiene they had to shower constantly, which made them a target for harassment from other inmates. Then there was the hassle and discomfort of having to shower constantly on top of the embarrassment. And on that unit, the showers were just one big room with the spigots lined up on a wall. And the rule was there must always be at least one CO to supervise the showers, presumably to prevent SAs. So they had to strip down and shower in front of another person every hour. Very dehumanizing. There's also the tampon tax. CO decides you're using way too many feminine products and rations them out. Decides the number you can use, which is always grossly under what you need. You're then forced to sit in bloated soaked pads or just free bleed. I've been subjected to that one way too many times and effing hate it. And before anyone tells me just don't do the punishment, i.e. refuse to run or clean, let me tell you that it's not really an option. Sure, you can technically refuse, but your punishment will be significantly worse if you do. I spent several weeks in solitary confinement for the infraction of nuisance contraband for having too many books. This infraction coincidentally came after refusing to clean up a particularly awful mess. I got 2 showers the entire time I was in solitary, and I was never allowed to have my legally required hour a day out of my cell. Also, it took me 3 years to earn a certain privilege level, and I lost all my privileges after the infraction of obscuring security's line of sight for setting my water bottle in the windowsill. That infraction was also coincidentally after another refusal. They make you jump through so many hoops to earn the smallest privileges that make life tolerable, but then yank them away at the slightest offense. If you piss off a CO, they literally have the quality of your life in their hands. Serving a long sentence already drains your soul, but it sucks so much worse when you have no privileges. Story 5. Thank God I never had to go to county, but did spend a day and night in the bookings in NYC. Queens specifically. I got busted because I was in a vehicle with someone doing drugs. They were hitting a pipe and the Tactical Narcotics Task Force, TNT, was parked right across from us. Dude threw his pipe at my feet as the D's were running up to the car. He wouldn't claim it as his, so they charged everybody. Everybody in the van. There was 3 of us, handcuffed in the back of a white panel van with no windows and a little seat. No way to stop yourself from falling over when they hit the gas because everything is slick plastic. We were the first ones arrested. They drove around doing busts for 3 to 4 hours until the van was full. Crack dealer, dope addicts, etc. The crack dealer had swallowed his pieces of crack thinking that would save him. He still got arrested. After an hour, he's not looking so hot. Sweaty, huge pupil shaking, his bags busted open after he swallowed them. We end up getting the D's attention, and they finally take him to the hospital. From there, we go out to the precinct for like 4 to 6 hours. Chill in a cell, nothing special. Next was Queens bookings. First cell, there was at least 75 people. They take all your info and blah blah blah. There's a dude in the cell talking wild loud. I got shot 10 times in '89. I can't control my bowels. I need help going to the bathroom. CO, I need help. Nah, dog, no help coming. They just walk right by. Now he's getting agitated. I'm finna crap myself, he says. Everybody's going wild now. 75 hood dudes like, CO, y'all better take him to the hospital or the nurse or do something. 2 minutes later, we all smell it. Old boy crapped all over. Now everybody's really going off, lol. Dude sees a CO coming and scoops up a turd and hurls it at him as he's walking by. I've never seen the gates open so fast and so many COs rush in and yoke somebody up. Holy F. The rest of the night was uneventful. Got a quick halal bologna and mustard and fruit punch and slept on the floor till I saw a judge. Got out the next day, ROR'd. Story 6. One of my favorite things to do was toss cells for looking for contraband. It was like a treasure hunt to me. I always was very respectful with inmate stuff. It could be what most would perceive as nothing, but I respected the inmates' belongings as I would want someone to with mine. If they had a clean locker, I would move things and then arrange them on their bed or another already searched area neatly, so when they returned to their cell, they could put things back neatly and efficiently. I had prisoners requesting that I do their checking when it came time. I did my job well and was known for finding a fair amount of contraband. Now I had a coworker who took what you might call the opposite approach. If he could break, ruin, or destroy property, he did with glee. He'd open food packages, accidentally spill, throw out photos, or anything of the sort. I watched him throw an inmate's legal folder in the toilet, and in a separate incident, tear up photos of an inmate's kids. He was an a-hole. I reported him, naturally, but was basically told that I should appreciate his tenacity. I only lasted 6 months in that environment, and was glad to switch roles to being a GED teacher, which was way better. I just don't understand people that use jobs like this as an excuse to have an outlet to be mean and despicable, and their justification is, well, these are inmates in jail anyway. Why would you tear up a picture of someone's family and kids? That's just cruel and mean for absolutely no reason. Story 7. I spent a weekend in a city jail/processing facility, not a full-blown jail or prison, due to a DUI. Yes, I was a effing idiot. I got 3 interesting stories out of it. 1, there was a guy in solitary across the room banging on the door. Obviously it's steel, but it still seemed like he might somehow break it. He was screaming, "They sold my female dog crack!" over and over. I saw 4 guards line up with riot gear and batons and go in. I just heard blows landing. I saw clothes flying out of the cell. They marched that man out of the cell, and he looked like that scene in Con Air where they bag and gag them. I was a little more nervous after that. 2, when in the drunk tank with 15 or 20 other dudes. One dude was sitting on the back of the toilet, i.e. where the tank in theory would be, with his feet on the seat. Another guy came up and said he needed to use it. He said go ahead and just spread his legs. We were all a little taken aback. 3, I spent the entire night talking and getting to know 2 different guys. They both seemed very nice, like they were picked up for something stupid. We get in front of the judge, and it turns out he had beaten someone within an inch of their life earlier that night. Just goes to show you, you never can tell. On another note, I expected it would be incredibly locked down. However, all the cell doors were open, and while you were expected to stay in your cell, in theory you could have wandered all around that area. Kinda surprised me. Story 8. My post is kinda late, but I got out of prison in upstate New York in October. I saw crazy crap. Prison is a wild place. One time, there was a fight in my pod. After fights, they have everybody stripped down to their drawers in their cubes so the COs can walk around and do body checks to see who was in the fight. Well, the people in the fight wore gloves, so their hands were fine. One guy's hands were shaking. They asked him why, and he said he was cold. They said bullcrap and took him to the day room. We hear him getting beat for a solid 5 minutes, and then a van came and picked him up. The next day, I heard from somebody in my vocational class they took the guy the COs beat to another pod, and 5 minutes after he got there, claimed there was a fight and did the strip search again, then beat him in the same manner and brought him to the box this time. Another thing I saw happen was in the yard. Somebody was smoking K2 and passed out. Well, while he was on the ground, the CO started kicking him, and they had to take him to the hospital. Prison is a crazy place. Highly recommend not going. Story 9. My longest stint in county saw a lot of crazy crap. Just for background, I'm white. My bunkmate was black. I have an anarchy tattoo on me. Somehow that meant I was in the Aryan Brotherhood. I was sleeping one day when I was awoken by some effing moron screaming at me for being a racist. Tried to explain what anarchy meant. It became obvious real quick the guy was just trying to pick on me because I was 17 and the youngest one in the cell block. The crazy part? The guy was white, lol. He yelled, "I got a black niece, mother effer. I'll see you at lunch." Okay, bruh. So I was in there with my confidant who had been locked up for several months before me due to being caught first for the F crap we did. We were huffing some kind of cleaning spray with an old timer discussing what I should do about this. My friend pulled out a effing lawnmower blade he smuggled in from his jail work BS and offered it to me. I declined. The old head then told me he could get meth. I had never done meth, but it seemed like the perfect time to do it. I traded 6 packs of ramen noodles to some other guy and railed a line of the crap. Geeked out of my effing mind, I went to lunch, sitting with just my confidant and some scrawny other dude he bunked with. Dude with the black niece came up to our table shortly after I got my tray and sat down. He made a whole scene and started grabbing my food. Now, I've seen a lot of prison movies. I know what I had to do. I picked up the thick plastic tray and smashed it in the guy's face. He looked dumbfounded for a second. As I stood up, I was already getting blows to the face by this tall-ass mother effer. One after another, I could not get the reach on this guy to land a punch. I dropped to my knees. In my amped-up rage, I had the best idea. I grabbed both his ankles, lifted, and pulled. The sound of the back of his skull smacking the concrete was unreal. Too real. He was unconscious instantly. I laid into his face, just his face, grabbing his neck by my left arm. I started smashing his face in with my right, over and over and over. At this point, his friends were kicking me, stomping me, trying to stop me. My black cellmate I mentioned, him and his friends jumped in and started beating the dudes that were beating me. The COs appeared in force. All of us were hit with tasers. The first one they hit me with only connected with one prong, so I got another one. 2 guards tasing me at the same time. I've never felt anything like that before or since. I remember seizing the F out, a metallic taste in my mouth, bit the crap out of my tongue. Everyone got beat the F up by the guards that day, even people who were just watching. Me, dude with the black niece, my bunkmate, and several other people got sent to the SHU. Solitary is the worst place I've ever experienced in my life. Now, back to the COs. The worst thing they did? I spent 97 days there with no effing toothbrush. I asked every single guard, every single day, for a goddamn toothbrush. Never got one. That's how my gum disease started. It's 9 years later, and I'm still bleeding every time when I floss. Never had this issue before that effing experience. I was able to bargain with another guy during my 1 hour a day rec time, walking around a hallway for 30 minutes, to slide me some of his toothpaste under the door right before I got out. But I still had to just use my finger to brush my teeth. Also, they served us moldy potato soup that I swear almost killed me, puking and dry heaving for several days. I didn't eat the last 3 days I was in because I knew I'd be out soon and didn't want to risk that again. Story 10. Wife's brother was in Rikers in the 1980s. He said the guards mostly ran much the same as prisoners, in gangs with each other. They intimidated and ostracized and threatened violence to other guards who didn't join in or didn't approve with what they were doing. So there wasn't much of a good cop or bad cop dichotomy, so much as there is a bad cop and a silent cop dichotomy. This involved working with prison gangs to organize beatdowns, essays, and murders within the prison. They were also the ones to run the drugs into the prison. From what I understand, it was just corrupt and awful to the bone in every way imaginable. Anyways, while SA was everywhere in the prison, actual homosexuality was looked down upon and guards generally brutalized homosexuals. In one instance, they had a drag queen. They stuck a baton up their ass and beat him on a pretty consistent basis, and would have other prisoners come in and SA him in his cell while they held him down. Guy ended up having HIV, and it spread to a bunch of guys who SA'd him. In response to this, the guards asked a gang to find the drag queen and murder him outside of the prison. They tried, except the drag queen ended up killing one of the people who tried to murder him, and he ended up back in prison for that, where he was tortured again and then finally killed. Now, he went back to prison in 2011 to 2014. He said it was radically different. Still awful, but much, much less chaotic and violent than it was in the 1980s. Story 11. My dad worked at Pelican Bay, a max security prison in California. He worked there since it opened pretty much and retired a few years back, so I've heard a few stories. One, there was a guard in SHU, secure housing unit, who was hooking up with inmates. She was actually my dad's ex, who I met, so that was interesting, lol. 2, a prison gang fight broke out in one of the yards with almost every inmate involved. It went on for a long time. There's a pretty well-recorded video of it, before they have enough people to shut it down. One guy got stabbed about 20 times and survived. 3, lots of crazy stabbings. One guy had his throat slit and also survived. 4, the only excessive force story my dad ever told me about was an inmate gassed one of the officers working SHU. So it's already an inmate in max security who's probably never getting out, throws piss and crap and everything else he can in a guard's face. The CERT team comes in to do a cell extraction. It's 6 guys in riot gear lined up behind a dude with a riot shield with the sole purpose of effing him up. After they beat him into submission and drag him out of the cell, they proceed to smash his body into every wall imaginable on the way out. My dad wasn't CERT team. He worked the control tower, so he didn't say what happened after, but I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. 5. Probably about 10 years ago now, California banned smoking in all prisons, so a bunch of guards were busted smuggling in cigarettes. And more recently, before he retired, guards were busted smuggling in cell phones. Story 12. Guy 2 cells down was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer after medical refused to test him for 3 straight months. Basically, if they tested him when he went into medical, it wouldn't have been terminal and they could treat it. Instead, it spread to his lungs and several other vital organs. That's just the start. One night, he starts crying out in pain, said his stomach had ruptured and he was in the worst imaginable pain. It took his cellmate several attempts to get a guard to listen, and after some of them come up to check on the situation, they took a wheelchair from another inmate and told this guy to get into it. He couldn't move, let alone get up, so they had to haul him into the chair, then call the medical staff and have the inmate try to explain the situation to them. Medical staff said he was lying and ignored the situation. The guards, not sure what to do with a man moaning and crying out in pain nonstop, decided to lock him in one of the common rooms overnight and ignore it. Around 9 p.m. the next morning, they finally drive him off to a hospital to get checked out. His stomach did rupture, and by the time he got into surgery, his insides had gone septic and he died. Edit to add to the story. He started out not being able to digest food, and changing his listed faith to Jewish so he might get some food he could actually digest. He went into medical to try and get checked out, but they said his blood pressure was too high or too low, I don't remember which, and that they would schedule him for another visit. That visit wasn't for another month, and we don't know we have it until the night before. The same thing happened at that visit, and the one after that. When he finally got the diagnosis, he was given the chance of writing it out as is, or getting treatment that would extend his life by a few months, maybe, but make his life hell. He chose to ride it out until the end. Medical would only give him Tylenol for his pain, which didn't work, and refused to help him with anything unless he got treatment. Seeing him go through all this and essentially get tortured to death by the officers and medical staff is something I'll never forget. These people have the power to be some of the worst people on earth, and they certainly abuse it. So, commented on it before, I'm gonna say it again. I know that these are people in prison, but why are you torturing and intentionally causing people pain that aren't causing any sort of disturbance while in prison? I'll never understand that mode of thinking. Story 13. Not my story, but my cousin's. Now, to get this out of the way, yes, my cousin is a convicted felon who fully acknowledges he broke the law habitually for many years, and yes, his crimes were serious and unacceptable. However, my cousin is many things, some good and some bad, but one thing I know he is not is a liar. I wouldn't trust him around my weapons, but I do trust his word and will take him at his word until given a reason not to, and as of yet, he has never given me such a reason. So that, mixed with the obvious pain and shame in his voice, I do believe this story. He was 23 years old on his 4th year of a 7-year sentence. He was involved with a gang on the inside for the typical reasons one joins a prison gang: safety in numbers. During a shakedown, one of the guards was attacked by his cellmate and pretty badly wounded. My cousin had nothing to do with it, but that didn't matter to the guards because he was a known gang member of the same gang his cellmate was. Both he and his cellmate were immediately taken out of the cell block. My cousin says he thought they were being taken to ad seg, but that's not what happened. They were both taken to a part of the prison where there was no cameras and beaten severely and had batons repeatedly and violently pushed deep into their rectums till they were literally bleeding from their a-holes. After they tortured them for quite a while, they took them to ad seg and they were left alone until their injuries had healed, so they couldn't report what had happened to them. As I said, there was a palpable pain and suffering in his voice when he told me that story, so that, mixed with my knowledge of him, tells me he was telling the truth. But also the fact that no guy is going to voluntarily admit to being SA'd in such a way unless it were true. It's just too embarrassing for us men to say we were violated like that, because there's a notion that being SA'd as a man strips you of your manhood or whatever you want to call it. We feel as though if we were SA'd, then it somehow makes us less of a man. So I have no doubts that he wouldn't tell me that story unless it were true, and just needed someone to reassure him that what happened to him was wrong. Story 14. Former CO here. My shift was the best on unit, but we had problem officers. One comes to mind thinking back. This particular officer would carry razor blades hidden under his name tag, rubber banded to his vest. When he was bored, he'd drop one in front of a cell on a round, next round kick it under, and the last round would pop the slot and spray the offender, calling for backup, claiming there was a wanting to self-unalive offender attempting to harm himself. Another incident, we had a guy who was being held in the holding cell in the hallway. He was quiet, not sure why he was there in the first place in the hall, really kept to himself in general. Mental health patient, and I'm assuming he was on the autism spectrum. No issues with any officer across the whole unit. This officer walked by, looked into the cell to make sure he was fine, and popped off and sprayed him with his gas, claiming the offender was trying to unalive himself with his too large boxer string. I was on cameras that particular day and watched all of it. Offender was sitting in the cell doing nothing, twiddling his thumbs basically, and the officer was just effing bored again. I reported it, but no investigation happened. This officer and I were not friends. My breaking point was when he turned on me. He sprayed his gas on his hand, covered with a glove, and speared a thick layer across my face and neck right before I did my round, about to walk into my pod. Needless to say, after I was done with our screaming match, reports to the head warden and our supervisors, he was put on his own probation period and under investigation finally for what he did to me, and being the only officer on shift with 5 times the number of any one of us 30 using our gas on offenders. I don't know what happened to him. I left shortly after because I moved cities. I hope he's gone. Officers like him are the worst people and a disgrace to the criminal justice system. I love my job and everything a good officer is supposed to stand for, and unfortunately there are so many just like him in every facility across the country. Story 15. I was transferred up north, 3 hours from home, and was one of the few Southerners in a northern UK prison. On my wing was a guy who quite obviously suffered from mental health. I was told he used to be quite normal, but he had been in a motorcycle accident which had left him scarred physically and mentally. Officers openly made fun of his unusual behavior and bad hygiene, but never really made any effort to help him. He also had epilepsy and, as a result, used to put a mattress on his floor so if he had a fit in the night, he wouldn't break his neck when he fell off the bed. Now, officers have to carry out a roll check every few hours, but it's fairly common for them to not really check on the prisoners, but just open up the observation flap and close it again once they saw the inmate was in fact in the cell. One night, the officer doing roll checks saw him on the floor on the first round and left him there. There were 2 more roll checks before morning, and no one checked he was okay. When morning came, I woke up to hear an officer who had just started his shift desperately performing CPR on the poor guy. He was crying. The guy had been dead for hours. His family were permitted to see his cell, but not before the officers conveniently cleaned it up, so as to give the impression he was living in much better conditions than he actually was. When I confronted the officer cleaning the cell about the illusion they were trying to feed the guy's family, he said, "It's not for them, it's for the next poor effer who would have to live with the smell, lol. I still think about that POS. No doubt he probably still goes on living his life happily, but I hope he doesn't. Edit. When you go to prison and are in the life, you kind of expect confrontation from other prisoners. It might just come to you because it comes with it and that is what it is. But this kind of mind effery that officers do is burnt into my mind more than any fight. This kind of violence is long lasting for real. Story 16. This may pale in comparison with some others, but it happened personally to me. Throwaway for obvious reasons. This happened when I was at a reception facility, the facility you go in between the county jail where you wait to be sorted into the appropriate prison for your charge. This facility is very old, over 100 years, and is miserable to live in. There are roaches everywhere in the cells, mice scurrying in and out, everything is busted and dirty. On to the jerkhead guard. So I'm a diabetic that takes insulin. I would get 2 shots a day and my cell would be open to let me out and go down to the infirmary wing. On this particular day, my bunkie was leaving, so the cell door opened and he left. I stayed and waited for the insulin call. Time goes by and I'm sitting in my cell unable to eat because I don't have any insulin in my system. I tell one of the runners to ask the CO if he can call the infirmary as I need to get my insulin. CO refuses to open my cell because, quote, "you should have gone when I opened it earlier." So at this point, he's basically refusing me something that is necessary for me to live. I start panicking in my cell, thinking about what I can do, but I don't have many options sitting in a jail cell. A little more time passes with no luck getting through, and luckily the infirmary calls down because I never showed up to get insulin, and the jerkhead finally lets me out. Another story, short, about the same CO. The cell I was in, my bunkie clogged up the toilet and hours went by and it would not clear up, but I really had to take a crap. Like, so bad that I'm doubled over in pain. When we're let out for rec, I ask the CEO if he can let me use the toilet in another cell or somewhere else, but he says, not my problem, and goes to sit down around the corner where I can't see him. Arguing won't really get me anywhere, except maybe solitary, so I try to deal with it as best I can. A couple hours later at the dinner time insulin call, I ask the CO in the infirmary wing to use the bathroom and he lets me. So yeah, that's my tale. If I had to deal with this a-hole for any longer than the 11 days I was there, I have a feeling I'd be making calls to my lawyer. Pretty sure it violates some kind of human rights laws refusing me insulin and bathroom. Well, that's in the past now, and unfortunately it is what it is. Story 17. When I was younger, I got arrested and had to do almost a year county time. I wasn't a troublemaker and really didn't want to extend my sentence, so eventually I was able to make way to work release. They issued us lockers, and they had locks on them. There was this one dude in his 40s that's always loud as F and talking bold all the time. He's at a table playing cards with 3 others and starts talking crap about this kid playing wrong, and he's trashing on how dumb he's playing. The hand was over and the kid walks to his room, nobody even paying attention. The kid goes over to the guy with his lock around his middle finger like brass knuckles and sucker punches the guy in the temple. He only swung about 6 or so more times and started stomping him. Everyone in the pod just backed up and watched. He got some actual football kicks in. The guy's head just knocked back and forth. By the time medical got in after restraining the first kid, the older guy was on the ground breathing heavily and, snoring. He had pink foam coming out of the side of his skull. He was spitting pink froth from his face. You could see the bone structure on the right side of his skull was caved in. His eye was hanging out. Both him and the kid were charged with fighting. He had to go back to county after the hospital stay and got his good time taken and another charge. The kid went to the big boy jail for a long while. There's really not a moral to the story, and it wasn't about the guards either. Shrug. Story 18. I was 6 months into a 2-year bid for forgery here in Connecticut once I developed an abscess which quickly became excruciatingly painful. Through official channels, I might have had to send a dental request form, and who knows how long it'd take before I heard, Johnson 332364, report back to AdTran for transport to dentist now, or if I even ever would hear it. The dentist facility was in another prison a long way away. Then the tooth would be pulled with minimal anesthesia and no pain meds to follow up. In any event, nothing was getting to happen anytime soon, and this crap was hurtin'. Luckily, I used to be well liked within the dorm, and a bunch of other inmates pooled together and presented me with a supply of aspirin, Motrin, and a few Orgel someone got somewhere. That helped and was much appreciated, but it had been a band-aid on a way worse problem. We happened to possess a female CO on duty that day, a lady about 35 with a personable and friendly disposition. She noticed I used to be in distress and called me over to seek out what was happening. I used to be in a lot of pain, and she or he was clearly sympathetic. I choose lunch in an hour. Let me see what I can do. Persevere there. 2 hours later, she returns and calls me over. She handed me a bottle of ibuprofen, a little bottle of Absinol, and more Oragel and a few of ice-cold gel packs, and said she would get more gel packs when she went on break. This woman was an angel, but the simplest was yet to return. Subsequent day, she came in to start out her shift and called me over, motioning that this needed to stay on the DL. She handed me a crumpled up ball of aluminum foil. Inside are 24 amoxicillin antibiotics. Take 3 per day until they're all gone. And needless to mention, don't get caught with these. I thanked her graciously, but she just put her finger to her mouth during a shh, be quiet gesture. A couple days later, my tooth started improving, a minimum of tolerably that would affect it until my bid was over and that I could get to a true dentist. I would occasionally see that CO around as she went through her different rotations, and she or he never more acknowledged me. That is, until the very morning of my release, she happened to be working the out-processing room. "Ah, Mr. Johnson, leaving today?" "Yes, thank God." I leaned over the desk and began to mention, "I really need to thank you one last time." "Shh. Don't mention it. Was glad to assist. Now get out of here and never come, you hear?" "I sure do, CO," and I never went back. See, so it is possible to do your job and still maintain your moral code and be a decent human being. Like, if these people aren't causing disruption or disturbance and they're in pain, look out for them. I mean, come on. Story 19. There was this guard, a dumpy little girl who did night duty in the medical wing, whose face was always blotchy and scabby from acne. One night, I was lying awake in my bunk, looking out at her as she sat at the guard's desk, and I saw her pop a pimple on her chin, inspect whatever it was that came out of it, and was now on the tip of her thumb, and then proceed to eat it. Even just writing this, I could vomit. When you're in jail, there's this phenomenon. The longer you're in, nesting with nothing but men, nearly any woman that you see regularly during that time will, presuming you're heterosexual, start looking attractive. Guards, medical staff, members of administration, even if on the outside you wouldn't give them the time of day. When you're in jail, they start looking positively ravishing. It doesn't really matter if they're older or fat or too skinny or whatever. When you've been in for a while, you'll start to notice at least something about them that you find attractive. Nobody thought anything was even remotely attractive about Nasty, as she was known. She was awful, always, and not just because of her appearance, or her being a pimple eater. She was piggish and rude, and everyone hated her, even other guards. Story 20. True history. From a survivor, Claudino de Cicadi, a friend of mine. There is another situation after the inmates tried to do an escape. We take officers as hostages, we ordered a bulletproof vehicle, and they ordered, enter the penitentiary and execute all them prisoners. How will we go ahead with just knives? There were so many with rifles and big guns, so we asked for the presence of the governor and of the justice minister to negotiate our freedom. But Fleury, the justice pro-mother, went to the gates of the penitentiary and said, execute all them prisoners. Right after that, it was the biggest massacre that ever happened. Much bigger than the Carandiru massacre, who was hidden by the media. They reported in the news that there was 21 dead bodies. All the television channels involved because they was the power at the time. They didn't want to negotiate with us. We were in the last yard, the third yard, with the hostages, waiting to go to our freedom. They put with the bazooka in front of the state's penitentiary and shot it at us. It was total slaughter. We couldn't do anything. They murdered 350 inmates, and I was one of the last survivors. There's people who are alive who can confirm my history and say if I'm lying. Me and the inmates who survived, who got recaptured right after, they did a polished corridor after putting us naked at the soccer field with the head between our knees. And whoever falls, they were stabbing. I saw a dude who fell, and they put the knife straight into the heart of that kid. And this was the biggest massacre that ever happened in Brazil, who was masked by the media. That history is from a friend of mine who did time from 80 and was now released in 2017. I wanted to share this history because of the injustice that happened at that time. Claudinho da Cicade. He told me that story falling in tears. Even though he's an old man now, he was one of the ones who had to help carry the dead bodies, so he knew how much people died in this situation. Story 21. I work in a state prison. It's max facility. I've worked max blocks, RHU, restricted housing unit, BMU, behavioral management unit. I teach our self-defense program as well as a lot of other courses, and was a member of our hostage negotiation team. I've had a wide variety of experience in my short time. I've seen a lot of assaults, nasty fights come with weapons involved, attempted self-unalivings, successful self-unalivings. Staff members walked out for smuggling in drugs and phones, etc. I was SA'd by a sergeant while I was a trainee. This was the first time I've told anyone. He had me look under a counter for something and grabbed and started pulling on my member. He told me to go ahead and report him because, quote, he's beaten all the other charges. I didn't want to be the new guy labeled as a snitch, and with most people knowing about this type of behavior, which was typical for him, but just considered it him being goofy, one of the good old boys club. I did not report it. I should have. A little piece of me died. I convinced myself I was being strong by not letting it get to me. Like most things in there, you learn to compartmentalize if you want to keep your sanity. I have typically had a good rapport with most of the inmates. I treat them like people. Like other people have said here, it's a respect thing. It also helps that the facility is out in the country, but I'm originally from the same city as about half our inmates. Once they figure out that I'm pretty chill and not just another racist white guy, we usually get along good. Not to say there were ever any rules I did not enforce, I just knew how to talk to people. I also had a string of bad luck there for a while where fights just seemed to break out around me no matter where I was working in the jail. So I got a rep as being fair across the board, but also not afraid to go hands-on when I had to, if absolutely necessary. This set me up pretty well from the start with both inmates and fellow staff. Anyway, a little after my training year was over, I was assigned to a regular block. There's a group of inmates in one of my wings that I got along pretty well with, and they were the old heads of the wing. Long story short, one night one of the old heads, who really was just kind of an older black man who was on some drug charges, got assaulted right in front of me by this younger guy twice his size. It was over a time slot on the phone. The younger guy's cellie had wound him up about it and basically told him, F that, respecting guys just because they're older crap and go F him up. So basically, big young dude two-pieces the old head, knocks him out standing on his feet, and runs back in his cell and shuts the door like a female dog. The effed up part was that the old head went straight down and split his skull open on the concrete floor. He was out. Blood started to pool around him immediately and he was not breathing. Luckily, help wasn't far away and medical got there fast. The nurse that checked him lifted his arms, which pushed some air back into his lungs. They said later it looked like he was puking up coffee grounds because apparently that's what happens when red blood cells die in your lungs. I still see that old guy around the jail sometimes and still get a nice greeting from him and some of the other guys that were around the block at that time. The young guy who assaulted him got locked up in the RHU that night and then transferred out of the jail because one of the snitches told the security office that a lot of people were not happy with him over it, and that if he were to ever be seen in the yard again, something real nice and permanent was going to happen to him. About a year later, I saw the jerkhead cellie that instigated him get his eye closed by another young boy with a lock and a trash bag. Justice served. The BMU is where I saw the most effed up crap. It was specifically a special unit created to hide problem inmates from around the state. These guys had behavioral health issues that were not necessarily connected to diagnosed mental health issues, so they were often jerkheads just to be jerkheads. One particular guy we had for a while and did quite a number of cell extractions, etc. on, had an interesting backstory. I read his paperwork. I didn't get this from him. Apparently, his crackhead mother sold him when he was 9 months old to a couple that routinely SA'd him, and physically until he was in his teens, and was in all kinds of placements throughout his teens, and he was essentially a product of the system ever since. So, I'm not saying it excuses his behavior, but I get it. I will say that one of the things that sticks with me about the place on an institutional level is that regardless of crime, there's no separation. One of our blocks had a notorious old school serial killer on it. We get along really well, actually. And a few calls down on the same block was an old guy from a couple towns over who was in for getting one too many DUIs. The last one was on his riding lawnmower. Story 22. Also, not an ex-offender. I worked a max facility for mental health offenders, and I think it's a toss-up between two things for me. The way we kept people from hurting themselves, which was severe and often, was to put them in 4-point restraints on a restraint bed. While this wasn't a punitive measure, it was isolating and hard to handle after laying around 24 hours a day in and day out, days at a time. Occasionally, the days would turn into weeks, and that was pretty messed up. And the rare person just could not be left alone or would try to unalive themselves, so they were left on that bed like that for a month. I saw a guy there for much more than a month once, and another guy who literally had someone watching him 24/7, every day, all day, no matter what, for months on end. And another one that's kinda effed up, also mentally screwing with people, is that we would get guys that were just delusional, of course. Officers sometimes thought it was funny to put, Jesus and Satan next to each other in opposite or side-by-side cells so they could F with each other. Screwing with people just ain't my thing. Prison sucks enough as it is. Our place would never ever had someone be able to punch someone, for instance, but the mental ways of effing with people was plenty. A smirk when you hand someone their food tray will set a guy off for a week in a place like that. Story 24. I've seen a few messed up things. The one that scared me the most was when a guard pulled out a homemade knife and told us if we acted up, he would stab us with it and blame it on an inmate and that he would get away with it. I also saw a guard pepper spray an entire room with mace just because two people were fighting. Like guys just sitting in chairs he ran up to and then sprayed them straight in the face. Emptied the whole can. It looked like everything was orange for a few days. By far the worst step though is the psychological torture. I spent months in confinement. Being in the same room forever will break you down. Books were rare. I think I read this one book at least 20 times. One inmate in the cell next to me was bricked or put on a meal plan that was a solid block of mostly cornmeal 3 times a day. He stopped eating the second day, and I asked to try it. It was inedible, and I saw him slowly waste away when he would walk by every 3 days for a shower. A man unalived himself with a bedsheet right next to me there. We kept calling his name so he could pass down a note. No answer. They let the body sit for over 8 hours. Flies were everywhere by then. And the coroner showed up and took a few pictures, and they bagged him up with less enthusiasm than someone taking out the trash at McDonald's. Rest in peace, Arthur. The worst feeling was getting out of the box and looking at the sky. It was this crazy feeling, like I couldn't believe it was all still there. The sky looked so big on that day. Story 25. When I first started working in a jail, one of the deputies used to jokingly lament that all the crazy crap seemed to go down on his shifts. He seemed to think that it was some sort of badge of honor that he was the department's crap magnet. Well, after working there for a while, I came to realize a few things. First, this guy was a pathological liar. Like, not in the overused sense of the word when people simply describe a dishonest person. This guy would just spout the most off-the-wall, grandiose crap that was blatantly untrue and actually believe it. Among other things, he claimed to have 2 master's degrees in psychology and criminal law, as well as being former special forces, a detective in LA, and DC SWAT. Next, all the fights, use of force, and assorted altercations that just seemed to happen to him for no reason was just another fabrication. He was instigating them so that he could write himself up in the report as the hero and look good for the brass, who were very disconnected from the jail, and often their only interaction with us was through reading our reports, so they just thought he was a swell guy. We had a guy come into booking, obviously tweaking on meth, and he basically body-checked the dude into the wall and pinned him there under the pretense that he knew the guy was gonna spool up. The guy was tweaked out, but was compliant. In the process of pinning him to the wall, he busted some of the guy's front teeth. On another occasion, an inmate well known for being in and out of our system and being very short-tempered was waiting for his release order. He was pushing the intercom button a lot. The deputy Superman went in there, slammed the door, and basically crap-talked the guy so that he would swing, and then tased him and charged him for it to keep him in there. On another occasion, he had been bragging about his master's degree in criminal law and had convinced an inmate facing serious charges that his case would be dropped. When it wasn't, and he was sentenced to 15 to 20 with no parole, he went absolutely ape crap in court. This was when I was escorting, and I unfortunately had to utilize an armbar hold to drag him from the courtroom. He was hysterical because he had been led to believe that he was going to get off scot-free and kept telling me, quote, "Deputy so-and-so said so, he effing promised." Guy ended up spending 3 days on self-unaliving watch. I was reporting all this to command, but was the new guy, so none of the brass gave the reports much weight. My coworkers were secretly supportive of me. They utterly despised the man, but they didn't have the balls to report him to brass themselves. His run came to an end when he had an inmate escape on him. He was on hospital escort and was in the hallway hitting on a nurse. The inmate had feigned that the restraints were hindering his ability to cooperate with the doctor's tests, so Deputy Superman had uncuffed and unshackled him. The inmate waited until Deputy Superman was distracted and in the hallway trying to impress the nurse with his made-up stories. He jumped out of bed, punched the doctor in the throat, then jumped out the window and booked it down the street. Luckily, a city PD car was just down the street, and the police officer saw a guy in orange sprinting down the street and tackled him 2 blocks down from the hospital. This man was in jail for some pretty serious offenses involving minors, and it was very, very lucky his escape was so short-lived. When it was investigated how exactly he'd briefly escaped, none of the Deputy Superman's answers matched what security footage or eyewitnesses reported. Among other things, in his wildly changing story, he tried to pretend that he had been overpowered and injured by the inmate. He's no longer working for law enforcement, but yeah, I don't know. Guy was a safety nightmare, abused inmates to make himself look good, and was an arrogant, self-absorbed, pathological liar. Story 26. I went to jail for a week, and because of how crowded it was, we got moved from holding cell to holding cell for 3 days. The worst thing that happened right before I got there was they stripped a man naked and marched him down the hall yelling, "Gay man walking, gay man walking." They threw him in a cell and he was beaten to death. This was the start of the FBI investigation into the jail. They separated everybody by race and put all the pisas, Mexicans that can't speak English, in a single cell. It was so crowded they couldn't even sleep on the floor like the rest of us, so they slept standing up while leaning on one another. They starved us so badly, I watched a man go into a diabetic coma. We begged for help on the intercom we had in the cell, and it took hours before anybody came to take the guy out on a stretcher. I was on medication at the time that, if I didn't get it, I had a high risk of having a seizure. After 2 or 3 days of being unable to get my medication, sure enough, I had a seizure. Apparently, I was smacking my head against the concrete for God knows how long, while people were again on the intercom begging for help. After I got taken out on a stretcher, a CO was calling me a crying little female dog, and said I was faking it. He said he'd have more respect for me if I just wanted out of that cell. After 20 minutes of this, set up an appointment to talk to a doctor so I could finally get my medicine. I got put in the medical ward after that instead of general population and met some interesting characters. My would-be cellmate was pacing up and down the hallway saying, I told that mother effer not to do that crap, and he did it anyways. He got what he deserved. Yeah, he got what he deserved. An old guy I made friends with must have seen the concern on my face and offered to switch places with me. I got a bunk in the dry room and he took my bunk. I had to write multiple letters for various inmates to their moms because they didn't know how to read or write. They were very appreciative and would give commissary items to say thank you. During my 7 days there, I never got to see a judge. I was taken back and forth to court and was told they didn't have time to hear my case every day. I was fortunate enough to be able to borrow money for an attorney on day 7. My attorney basically said what they were doing was illegal and they better release me. My holding period was up and they had no evidence against me. They released me that same day. If I wasn't fortunate enough to be able to afford a lawyer, who knows how long I would have been there. Overall, seeing how broken the system is firsthand made me realize how desperately we need criminal reform. Story 27. I was in PC for various reasons. What this meant was that I was in a cell with 2 other guys in a cell meant for 1. One day, a lieutenant arrives to inform us that they're putting in a guy who's been kicked out of everywhere else. He threatened to throw us into Gen Pop. His words were to the wolves if we couldn't get along with him. So right away, I knew we were in trouble. Guy was a paranoid schizophrenic as far as I could tell. Extremely nervous, extremely annoying, constantly singing the same lines to himself, too dumb to play cards, not really interesting to talk to. The problem was that he was constantly antagonizing the guards with his stupid demands. He wants a new cup, a new spoon, new clothes, new blanket. He'd lose his crap when they told him no, especially since he wasn't polite either. Over the course of a week, the guards twice rushed into the cell to intimidate and threaten him. He was really pissing them off. Then he started hoarding food. Dude was skinny, so he didn't eat much, but he was certain the guards were going to stop feeding us. He figured wrapping a whole loaf's worth of bread in toilet paper was somehow going to keep it fresh. So he's getting crumbs everywhere, moldy bread is starting to grow, and he won't let us throw it out. Then he starts on the hypochondriac stuff. He thinks there's a bug in his ear, he's making himself sick by constantly trying to bring up phlegm. Myself and my cellmate tried to curb some of this, but it only bred resentment. He thinks I'm lying to him about not knowing French because I know a few words and phrases. I'm in Canada after all. And that I'm lying about not smoking cigarettes. I explain that I smoke weed but not tobacco. Oh, and I must be a bad person because I'm fat. So he's cursing at me in French, but I don't understand any of it. I'm getting myself paranoid that I'm going to wake up with an arm or blanket around my throat. Finally, we'd had enough of his threats and bringing down trouble on our heads, and we kick him out with the help of one of the helpful guards. Yeah, we ratted on him, but we're already in PC, and I don't plan on going back to jail. I also don't give a crap that someone who will spend his life institutionalized is going to have the capacity to come after me. Naturally, this pissed off the lieutenant and his lackeys. I was already scared of what kind of sick retribution he's going to bring down on me, but I knew his threat was a bluff. Nothing happened right away, but they did put in a new prisoner, another guy with schizophrenia, but also kind of developmentally delayed. He loved coffee, but didn't have the hand-eye coordination to work the packets properly, so I'd help him. He was a moron and delusional, but ultimately harmless and not nearly as annoying. I was a bit of a wreck from the stress, and it was exasperating my own mental health problems, so I put in a formal request to speak to the chaplain that'd been visiting me. The a-hole guard who took it wrote, in his own handwriting, I want to unalive myself. This brought the doctor, the nurse, the a-hole guard, and the lieutenant to see me about it. I pointed out that the handwriting doesn't match, and it did not say that when I handed it in. It didn't match my other cellmate's handwriting, and the new kid could barely write his own name correctly. They were obviously trying to get me to accuse the guard of doing it so they could punish me, so I stuck with what I knew. Someone changed it, but I don't know who, but it wasn't us. Since they had to do this in front of the doc and nurse, they couldn't justify putting me on self-unaliving watch. Thankfully, that was the end of it, but the guard was still a massive a-hole. Refusing yard because it was raining, refusing to let us clean our cell, things like that. He wasn't there all the time, so it didn't really matter in the long run. I know this probably isn't so bad to a lot of stories here, but the point is that they tried to screw up my sentence by fabricating a self-unaliving threat because I wouldn't let some unhinged a-hole terrorize me. Story 28. Story from my distant uncle about his brother, who worked as a guard for lifers up in some penitentiary in New York. He described the place as where almost everyone there was someone who would be on death row were they not in New York State. People with literally nothing to lose who consequently became animals, as he said. Like, these guys would have HIV, build a makeshift cup, piss in it, and just wait all day for someone to walk past their cell so they can throw it in their eyes. I don't know if HIV transfers that way, but they at least believed it did. They'd make knives and rub them in feces and attack people with them for little to no reason. All in all, it sounds like hell on earth. Anyway, apparently one day there is a new female guard in his wing, block, I don't know the terminology to be honest, and one day she drifted to sleep on a long boring shift. A group of inmates quickly sees the opportunity to surround and violate her. Apparently my uncle's brother, after essentially shooing the guys away and having them go through lockdown, looked down at the female who was still on the ground in shock, and all he had to say was, "Maybe you won't fall asleep on shift next time," and walked away from the medical staff to tend to her. I never forgot that story. I never met the guy who allegedly did this, but it's a very cold reminder of just what people can be reduced to when immorality is the norm. Story 29. Not an ex-convict, but my father is a retired prison guard. He used to work at high security state prison when I was growing up. There was a period of time where he was on the edge, and he told me a couple years later he was under investigation for the death of an inmate. Turns out, my father was supposed to be watching a wanting to self-unalive inmate who was making a scene and kept talking about unaliving himself. My dad told me that he got tired of listening to the inmate and told him something along the lines of, "If you were going to unalive yourself, you would have done it already, and even if you did, it wouldn't matter. Nobody loves you anyways." Then proceeds to go take a nap or F off for a couple hours. My dad always bragged about how little he did at work. Well, the inmate he was supposed to be watching ended up unaliving himself in his cell when my dad wasn't paying attention. There was very little repercussions for my father egging on a wanting to self-unalive inmate. Like, the worst that happened is his transfer to a new prison was delayed by a couple years. He worked at a prison with a violent group of guards and inmates, but my father definitely contributed to everything that was wrong there. Story 30. I was 11 years old on a children's unit in San Bernardino, California, and it was time for church, and two guys started fighting, and a CO named Seagull, African-American guy, whom almost got drafted by the Indianapolis Colts as a linebacker, walked into the bathroom and, like Superman, spread the two apart and threw one kid about 10 feet into a wall that was with his left hand, and with his right hand picked other kid off the ground and, all in one motion, held him in the sky by his throat and pepper sprayed him while strangling him. Soon after, more people started fighting the guards, and it was also offenders, Mexicans versus blacks, fighting each other. And I continued to sit there in amazement at the pure hostility. And I could see guards running from everywhere, and there was this little chubby lady in the back of the group carrying what looked like a fire extinguisher. And she burst through the door directly in front of me and pointed it right in my face and proceeded to pepper spray an entire group of people, starting with me, who was sitting down. Not fighting at all, I remember it was like a battleground on an ancient battlefield with no weapons, and we all got gas attacked, and the stuff they used, if you weren't even used to it, would make you crap and piss yourself. And this was my first day in. Central Valley Juvenile Hall, San Bernardino, California, 2007. Story 31. I'm not sure if the facility I'm in is different, or our state laws are different, or our HR hires CEO that can handle the kind of heat they'll be put through here. I haven't seen too many cases of horrific violence yet. Then again, I've only been working as maintenance in this place for a single year. There was a case of an inmate beating the crap out of one of the CEOs. That said, I think some CEOs need to remember that prison isn't necessarily meant as punishment. It's supposed to be about rehabilitation. Making some damaged person's life worse isn't a great way of bringing down their violent tendencies. If anything, it'll just redirect their anger at their fellow inmates. I'm not partial to sitting on a powder keg with a torch in hand. I think the best COs remember that and treat the offenders with at least as much respect as they're shown. They also tend to get in less altercations. Not to beat a dead horse, not to continue to belabor this point, but I completely agree with this. Why are you sitting on a powder keg with a torch in hand? You're making your job more difficult, and you're also decreasing the likelihood that some of these guys may have to reform themselves. Story 32. I never went to prison, but I went to regular jail. Nothing went on my record, by the way. I got lucky. One time was for picking up furniture outside by the curb, no Miranda rights read, and another couple of times I sat out tickets, which I just used jail to catch up on sleep. So they weren't feeding us full meals, literally only giving us honey buns, like sugar glazed pastries, and water, lol, which I laughed and ate with a smile on my face while we watched TV. It was chill. But one guy came in and called the cops like a racist or something, and the cop was like, "I'll show you racist," or whatever he said, and took the guy's honey bun thing and stomped it into the ground. And every time they brought us food, he literally stomped that guy's food into the ground and would get someone to come sweep it up. After that, I was like, holy F. I quit asking the guards why they think it's illegal to pick up another person's garbage furniture, or why it's illegal to put certain things in your body. I just shut the hell up and waited to be released. Miss me with that starvation crap.